I'd been going in and out of Africa. I was training to be a community organizer in East London, helping out with some small charities. And I'm not sure many people know this really, but lockdown was a complete disaster for the charity sector in the UK. 50% of UK charities said they were going to go bankrupt during lockdown. And yet at the same time, bankers and lawyers had some of the best years of their careers since 2008 during 2020, 2021. TransferWise IPO'd during lockdown. Money kept flowing around the world. And part of this was, how do we square that circle of all these people trying really hard to make a difference on nothing, and people pressing buttons and getting shed loads of money.
I'm Hattie Willis, your host, and each episode I talk to an entrepreneur, investor, or startup expert to unpack their hardest moments, biggest wins, and hard-earned advice so we can shortcut our learnings as founders together. This episode, I'm joined by Robert Hayward, founder of GoodFX, an international payments B Corp that turns currency conversion into social good, using the profits they make every time their customers trade FX to support charities and create meaningful job opportunities for refugees. For anyone who doesn't know, the foreign exchange market, commonly referred to as Forex or FX, is a global marketplace for trading currencies. Having spent 10 years in the city working in banking, Robert started to wonder how he could put his skills to use and make a difference in the world. After initially rejecting an opportunity to work in FX, he realized there could be a way to use some of the money the industry was making in lockdown to make a difference, and this birthed GoodFX. In this episode, we discuss Robert's journey into entrepreneurship and how he used his skills learned in the corporate world to get there, the intoxicating nature of working with a big fish company, using a business model as a vehicle for social change, raising money as a B Corp and the real value of B Corp applications, the importance of having self-value as a fundraiser, and the necessity of bootstrapping when making an impact business. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to the show, Rob. It's such an exciting time to have you here.
Thank you.
And we're going to unpack your journey. We're going to go into your funding journey as well. We've just been talking a little bit before we started recording. But before we go into that, can you give us a little bit of an overview of your background and whether entrepreneurship was something that you saw in your future or whether it was a surprise when it came to it?
So my background, I was 10 years in the city. I was actually an ESG portfolio manager 12 years ago, before ESG was cool.
It was still a thing 12 years ago?
Yeah, it was just starting. And it was really data driven and didn't really change the world. And I thought, this will never catch on.
Brilliant.
So I did that for 10 years, always knowing that I wouldn't want to do it forever. But it's a really good place to start to understand the world and how it works. And then didn't really have a plan for what next. So it's been a journey of just figuring it out. And GoodFX was part of that journey.
And GoodFX is obviously a very impact-focused business.
Yeah.
So has that always been a space you knew you wanted to work in? Because obviously going into kind of banking world often has less, shall we say, impact association, even though you'd obviously tried to find a space that was with the ESG side. So was that an element you always knew you wanted?
Yeah, well, I worked for charities and politicians as a student, and then kind of just needed to pay the bills in London and got dragged into the city. But I worked in impact. When I left banking, I went out and worked for some sustainable businesses in Africa. And 2019 was my year for just mucking around, really, thinking, how can I put my skills to good use? How can I make a difference? And kind of thinking, I'll do something sensible again in March 2020.
Okay.
And that's it's not how it went.
So you just paint us this picture, because I think it's actually something founders aren't honest and upfront about enough. So you'd saved, quit your job, is that right? And then you've given yourself like an experimental year.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then March 2020 plan is serious business, which we know doesn't happen. So what does happen in March 20? Well, other than COVID, but obviously COVID context pretty key. So what happens March 2020 that changes everything?
So I'd been going in and out of Africa. I was training to be a community organizer in East London, helping out with some small charities. And I'm not sure many people know this really, but lockdown was a complete disaster for the charity sector in the UK. 50% of UK charities said they were going to go bankrupt during lockdown. And yet at the same time, bankers and lawyers had some of the best years of their careers since 2008 during 2020, 2021. TransferWise IPO'd during lockdown. Money kept flowing around the world. And part of this was, how do we square that circle of all these people trying really hard to make a difference on nothing, and people pressing buttons and getting shed loads of money?
Why was, maybe a stupid question, but why was charity so hard in that period? Like, why were 50% going to go bust?
Well, all the traditional fundraising mechanisms stopped. There was no London Marathon, there was no bake sale, there was no face-to-face interaction.
Of course. Okay.
And there was emergency funding from the government, and that's rolling off now.
Yeah.
And, considering the current economic climate, fundraising really hasn't recovered. It's still a really tough time for charities.
And it feels like it's such a hard space to be operating in. Even without crises, there's increased competition for donations. It's very fragmented.
Yeah.
Really hard space to operate. So you're coming into this from the lens of you're going to join a charity as a community organizer. You're now seeing there's this big systemic issue. So what does the idea come to you as it is now? Curious, like how that nugget started to form.
The truth is that somebody rang me up and said, "Do you want to work in FX?" And I went, "No."
Brilliant.
Because nobody really likes those guys. They're sort of.
We love you, FX listeners,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
no one likes them.
Yeah. And that was my, I have very nice colleagues now, and, But then I looked at it and I went, hang on, they're earning how much during lockdown?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if you're earning that much during lockdown, you could give some away and start sharing that.
Yes.
And there was always a problem when the thing with companies, every company wants to do more good things, but they have this problem of primacy of shareholder return, where they have to put their shareholders first. They can't just start giving money away, because legally they have to put their shareholders first, and the shareholders want dividends, they want return on capital. But there's already a line in companies' accounts that is their banking costs. So for me, I was like, this is jackpot. There's this cost line that nobody thinks about. If we can repurpose that and turn it into funding for good things, then we're onto a winner.
I really like that, because I often say when I'm coaching impact businesses, particularly more on the charity CIS side, I think one of the really hard things is we always want to be like, well, just do some good.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you're trying to change something that adds something in, to your point,
Yeah.
it all becomes very discretionary and very hard.
Yeah.
So it's amazing you've seen this line item that they can't get rid of.
Yeah.
Like, banking, pretty critical to the
Yeah.
business, but maybe there's some room to wiggle there.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've had this, I love it. So you've got this kind of thread of, you've picked up the phone to someone asking you if you want to be in the space. You're like, absolutely not. And then you're like, oh, interesting space.
Yeah.
So where do you go from there? How does the idea start to get tested, I guess? And what are your first steps as a prospective founder?
I started making mistakes very, very quickly. So I thought of a good name, GoodFX, because we make GoodFX. And then I thought I'd get a cheap website, Googled cheapwebsites.com, got a terrible outfit who just overcharged me for everything.
How much did you pay? Because I feel like, again, we're just not telling people this stuff, roughly.
I can't remember now, to be honest. But
Yeah.
there are plenty of really good, cheap tools, like Unicorn platforms, a really easy tool, just as, AI-powered website builder.
Love that.
You can just throw up a very sharp-looking template very quickly, and it costs you, I think it's £9 a month. Actually, I can't. Don't hold me to that.
No. But I do think there's this order of magnitude thing of, we think, especially if you've come from a different space.
Yeah.
I think you think, oh, website's going to cost thousands.
Yeah.
And so someone quotes you thousands, and you think, how reasonable.
Yeah.
But actually, to your point, it's a £10 a month subscription.
Yeah.
Rough order of magnitude versus thousands. And I think all of these little things really add up. And I know we're going to come back to the kind of default funding.
Yeah.
But I think if you've got in your mind, I've got to spend 10,000 on a brand and 10,000 on a website and 10,000 on, then you start, of course you need to fundraise, but actually if you're new to this space, there is, and only increasingly exponentially, how many of these things you can access cheaply.
Yeah. You can throw something up very quickly and easily just to give yourself a presence. And that starts attracting people to your mission. And that's something I wish I did quicker. I was talking to a friend before this. So what do I wish I did differently? And it was attract other people to share in this quicker.
Okay.
Which is hard for purpose-led businesses because you're like, this is my purpose. No.
Interesting.
But then sharing that purpose with other people or attracting them.
And I think that's a super common mistake as well, because people often think someone can steal the idea.
Yeah. And I don't mind. Like, people say this to me. It's like, what happens if somebody comes and does what you do and steals it? I'm like, what? Redistribute banking profits to fund charities and create jobs for refugees. Somebody else also wants to do that. I don't care.
Yeah.
Like, 2 people doing it would be totally fine.
It's really funny you said that. We did an episode a few episodes back now with my co-founder. And I don't remember saying this, but he still remembers like our first meeting and me slightly aggressively being like, well, I don't even care if you take my idea. Like, if you do it, great, do it. I just want it to exist.
Yeah.
So love that. Okay. So you've got this first website.
Yeah.
What next? What do you do with it?
Well, strangely, I got a call from a friend of a friend who worked at UNICEF who said, do you do FX for charities? I was like, yeah. And they were like, well, we're thinking about innovation in the charity sector. Like, why don't you come and do a global competition with us? And that was a learning. It was great exposure for us, but you kind of got the gold rush. In my head, I was like, wow, we're working with UNICEF and we're just a brand basically. And they're great. You know, they do amazing work. But for other founders, I think the lesson would be when you have a big fish like that, the length of time it takes to get anything done or whatever, it's intoxicating because you're like, wouldn't it be amazing to help UNICEF? Because UNICEF do great stuff. But you've still got a business to run. And what do you do for 6 months?
I actually think that's the best way I've ever heard it described, intoxicating, because
Yeah.
that exactly sums up that feeling of like, it all goes to your head. You're like, we're making
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Like, call your parents, like,
Yeah.
I'm not a failure.
Yeah.
Like, I promise I'm completely worthwhile. Yeah. Okay. So you start working with UNICEF. And at this point, has the idea changed ever, or is the idea still the same?
No, it started purely as fundraising for charities. So we basically white label existing financial technology products and we implement them to our clients. And then a third of our program manager fee gets donated to the charity the client's choice. So it's basically as treasury teams and CFOs use this system, banking fees escape into the atmosphere, and we capture them and just plug them into good causes.
Love it. And so from the customer side, exactly the same costs, everything else stays the same, but you're just doing good on top.
Yeah. Typically, we save people money as well.
Okay. Anyone listening who's big, take notes. Just say, we'll set up a call for you.
Yeah.
Just get in touch. Okay. So the idea, so you start working with UNICEF. You mentioned the kind of time to get anything done. And this is not a hate on UNICEF, but like this is so universal as an experience. So can we unpack like some of those things, like expectation versus reality?
Yeah, and that goes for a lot of large clients that you work with. I can't explain it more than the intoxication, because there's also a dynamic for founders where you're invited to speak on stage at stuff, you're invited to podcasts, and that's part of the theater of what you have to do. You're building presence as a brand, but that can't replace you then have a full day's work to go and do after that. It's not in place of work, it's what you have to do on top of your day job. And I think that's the important thing, is recognizing where that work sits as in terms of the value you're actually creating.
I think it's something we touch on a lot with founders if we raise one of my companies, because we see it like increasingly. If you want to build a business that can reach more clients, or if you want to fundraise, and we'll come on to that, then it is helpful to have a personal founder brand. But to your point, you can't, and I often have people who say to me, are the founders who are shouting about it this much on LinkedIn actually doing any work? And I'm like, yes, I'm afraid they are. And they're not superhuman, it is just brutal.
Yeah.
But I like that you're being honest about, and I think it's something to be really mindful of as a founder. I'm going to put out a theory, but I think because suddenly being a founder, you're desperate for validation
Yeah.
of the idea of your life choices.
Yeah.
It's really easy to look for them in these points of like, oh, good. Okay. Someone wants me to talk about it. I must be
Yeah.
real. So it's totally understandable. But to your point, you've got to kind of sober up a bit and keep going with the good work in your case. Love that. Okay. So how does the idea evolve from there?
Actually, it was a friend of a friend who runs a social enterprise reskilling refugee and female talent in the Middle East into IT and coding skills. And they were having problems moving money into the Middle East. And they said, look, have a chat with my friend. He knows the space. He can probably point you in the right direction. We didn't end up being able to help them on the moving money side for various reasons, but it really opened my eyes to why were we using a normal web development service? If we want to be this force for change, why can't we just start replacing very particular blocks of the business model with refugee-led social enterprises? So they did our website design. They're called Concat. There's Step Up One, who train refugee talent in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. They've been doing some of our social media work. Can we use our business model really as a vehicle for change as well? And it started just by leaning on refugee-led social enterprises. And then there was always something in the back of my head in finance that nobody's really interested in developing D&I talent in the city. There's a very peculiar dynamic within that whole question of, let's not grow talent, let's just collect the talent that already happens to exist in the city.
Yeah.
And that's quite ugly. But why can't we just replicate like the grad scheme I did when I went into banking? If we can show people the skills that's necessary for entrepreneurship and learning about the city, can we share this wealth with people as well? So then we started deploying education programs for refugees to learn about commercial sales and skills and finance education. So my head of sales, Nova, she's deeply passionate about the capacity for social mobility once you make somebody economically important to a company. If you attach them to revenue, then the companies start to value them and then they get paid more. And then that's where social mobility comes from.
Love that.
And then there's a great company called Finance Unlocked, and they provide finance education packages to banks.
Yep.
And they're also a B Corp, I think. I can't remember how we started talking to them, but basically they've been really supportive of our work. They let our refugees have their lessons for free. And we've seen some great talent come through. It's really cool. But yeah, the 10-week programs remotely deployed. We've done 2 now. The third will launch in February next year, hopefully with more of a focus on female entrepreneurship, because we do mixed classrooms, but there is a problem we have with women not feeling comfortable in those surroundings. It's an interactive classroom for various reasons. We think we should do a female-only classroom, but that's quite cool.
I love that. And I think it's such a good challenge to anyone listening to actually twofold, right? You've innovated on a business model and I don't mean this, I mean this is the greatest compliment, in a very simple way. I think often we try and over-engineer these innovations and actually the biggest power can come from how do we change actually how we deliver this and the value that's tied to the revenue.
Yeah.
And, what 3 words I think is another great example where you're like, that's so simple.
Yeah.
Why hasn't anyone else done it? I think is like the best compliment
Yeah.
you can get as a founder. But also, I love that you've then looked at your own operations, and we will put links in the show notes to all of those incredible organizations. If anyone else wants to check them out and use them, we've got someone vouching for them. So that's always helpful in startup world when it's very overwhelming. But I think it's really a great reflection point to say, well, what about our business as usual? Could we do unusually that would deliver impact beyond just the value that we add to our clients, which is obviously the first place to look.
Yeah.
So you start innovating on how you operate. Let's talk about how you're funding and growing this, because I know we had a little chat beforehand and thank God we agree. So I can actually ask you the question. Otherwise I'd just, hide it under the rug.
Yeah.
But what was your approach to funding?
should I look at my notes?
Yeah, exactly.
So
What did I tell you
what did
to
I
say?
Okay, so I've bootstrapped it so far. I've worked various jobs, was doing B Corp registration documents in the evenings and weekends, and it is hard. But I think when you're in the early stages of testing, it's much better to make the mistakes on your own time and money, because every time you raise money, you're giving away part of your equity. And one of the mistakes I made, I think, was when B Corp came through, I was like, right, all I have to do is raise some money and go out there and hire some people, and they can figure out this business model for me. And you see that with some founders who are so intent on raising the money, but you really need to do some graft first, is my perspective, because you'll be much more attractive to a founder if you can show like you found 5 clients, you know what you're
100%.
talking about, you're a bit more authentic in the market, you made some mistakes, and you know where you want to go.
What were you up to that? Because you said that was your thinking originally,
Yeah.
that you would go and raise. So was it the market reality of trying to raise? Like, what changed your mind? Yeah, was that?
Yeah, it was just pure reality of, also, we're a very sales and marketing focused company, and sales talent is incredibly expensive and incredibly wasteful a lot of the time. And I was sitting down with people who wanted this much base and this much equity and this much bonus. What? It just didn't make sense. So kind of had to pull back from that and say, okay, if we're not going to do it this way. And there's plenty of really smart sales and marketing tech out there now. Like the expensive salesperson that comes to you and says, I've got this book of business, would you pay up for it? And you're like, well, there's a sales bot powered by AI who's probably going to find the same thing. Give it 6 months. So yeah, that's getting the sales and marketing engine right, knowing your business model, and also getting your business just to a point where you can say with confidence that if you put petrol in the engine, you know it will fly. Not, can I have some money to burn until I work out how this might work?
And I think it's such an easy mistake to make with the sales piece, because lots of us don't enjoy sales.
Yeah.
And lots of us as founders want to be on the delivery impact side, because maybe it feels more directly rewarding.
Yeah.
Hands up, that's totally me. But I think one of the challenges that we often see with founders is at the beginning, when you're still working out that value, it is so founder-led.
Yeah.
And actually, you don't know what sticks. You don't know what marketing messages work repeatedly. Yeah. And if you try and outsource it too early.
No. And the marketing people will come and find you and say, please, can I have £5,000 to write you a straw man of your target customer? And you're like, no, that's £5,000. And like, that's a lot of money. But just talking to people, I think always find a problem to fix. And if you don't have a problem to fix, you've just got to start pulling on strings. Like somebody says, I've got this problem, go and fix it and see what they say, and then fix it some more. Because that's especially true for purpose-led businesses. You might feel really passionate about the world needs to change in this way, and my business will change the world in this way. But people don't have to buy into that. What you're doing is a business. If you want to change it like that, go and do think tank stuff.
And I think often with purpose-led businesses, it's easy to be like, I've got the solution that everyone else has missed.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes you go and talk to the stakeholders, and there are so many examples of this in many books about how you end up, designing for a context you've not really understood, and you make the problem worse, or you really miss the need. And to your point, if you're outsourcing that customer research, how do you it just scares me.
Yeah.
That is the only part of your business, in my mind, you have to get at the beginning is, what does my customer need?
Yeah.
In their own words, I should be able to replay to you literally story after story after story that I've heard firsthand. And if you can't do that, everything's going wrong. We've had so many lessons already of actually thinking about what traction points can you get before you fund, and the freedom that gives you as a founder to explore. And I think that, let's be honest, there are impact investors out there, but if you are on certain trajectories that are very financially motivated on return, you don't get the freedom you've had to play around on the back end of what can we make more impactful, because that will slow you down a little bit. Not hugely, but
Yeah.
they care about those little bits.
Yeah. And especially the current climate where you have major geopolitical events slowing things down, speeding things up. We've had the cost of living crisis. If I was VC backed and all the way through the last 2 years, they were saying, I want X growth every month, X growth. You're like, what? It's not possible.
Mm.
And by the way, people have COVID and they're long-term sick and people just go offline for 2 weeks. It's a tough environment.
And so that brings me back to a question around starting something. I'm making an assumption that this isn't a regulated business. Is that right?
No.
So I think sometimes people think to build around financial services is all untenable without regulation, but that's just not true. And I think more and more can be done through this white labeling approach, or getting partners to underwrite, or partners to fulfill certain functions as banking as a service, all sorts of things there.
Yeah.
How did you get started on that side of things? And what have been the challenges of, because you've got two sides to this marketplace, right? You've got to bring the companies who want to do the banking, but you've also got to bring the other side.
Yeah. Spot FX is an unregulated industry. When it comes to the more complicated financial products, they are regulated. So it's knowing clearly about the lines. I think a lot of the white label companies, their compliance functions are very robust. So you can have very secure conversations with them, and you're not alone. I come from a heavily regulated background, so I'm quite comfortable. I know what I'm doing. I don't think that should stop other people from saying, I don't really know, but just engage with, pull forward the compliance teams of the service providers, because they are the regulated entity. It shouldn't be on you. And if you're going for full regulation, you'll have a compliance officer who needs to be fit and proper.
And I think it's also true that you can change your approach to what you do and don't outsource over time. So to your point, sometimes you might outsource at the beginning, have a company that, you white label and do it that way. And then there might be another version down the line where you go, no, we now want to bring this in-house. So I think it's also thinking really strategically about what are the proof points we need now, really. Do we need to know that we can do it ourselves? Actually, no, because we can do it with a partner. Do we need to know that customers want this, use it, will sign up for it, how they interact with it? Much more important.
Yeah.
So what have been the kind of biggest challenges, other than we've had some early starting ones, we've had some funding ones? What about other big challenges along the way?
It's not really a challenge, but as I mentioned, finding good people to share this with, that share the mission, because you have people that get finance and you have people that are passionate about the impact side. Finding the bit of the Venn diagram that sits onto that's been a challenge, but got a really good team now. I'm really happy, slightly lucky, but very happy about that. Then it's just growth. The B2B payments marketplace is incredibly overfished, and we're going in saying, we know it's completely flooded. The payments industry is out of control with the number of companies, but we're doing something slightly different. It's just getting to the part of the conversation where you say, we do FX, but we're doing something different. Because a lot of people, because it's been so overbroked and oversold, CFOs and treasurers have insulated themselves from cold call approach, and breaking through that is quite hard, because you're trying to push yourself to the front and say, I know you get this call 10 times a day about FX, but we do. And having FX in our title, people look at the name, at a conference and somebody says, oh, it's FX. Oh.
And how do you get past that? Is it by just going quite quickly to the bar, or have you found some good tactics? Because I think that's a really good thing to name, that lots of people will be trying. And actually, I think people are so scared to try cold calling.
Yeah, and cold calling's painful. You just got to do it and be comfortable with the fact that it will be uncomfortable for 90% of the time. And then you have that one good conversation and you feel great. I mean, we can flip it around. We say we're a B Corp that repurposes international banking products. So the gatekeeper doesn't hear FX and goes click.
That does bring me to another question I wanted to dive into, because B Corp has, become massive.
Yeah.
And I think lots of founders still aren't quite sure what it will deliver versus what it takes. And obviously you're very involved in doing B Corp applications, but what's your sense on how valuable it actually is, what it is and isn't good for?
Yeah.
And when a founder should think about it in the process? Because it sounds like for you guys that has been a differentiator, but yeah, really curious where it doesn't work.
Yeah. I think you have to have one full head of capacity full time on it.
Wow.
To get it done, for whether that's 6 to 8 months of paperwork. Like it's a big undertaking to do. I don't think you can underestimate the capacity it takes to go through all the processes and make sure everything's documented and evidenced. And
one person full time, 6 to 8 months.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. I know it's a long thing, and I'd have grossly underestimated that.
That's just my personal,
the
capacity for your business to have that. B Corp was really important for us because it gets a lot of flack, but there's very few systems where you can hold intention repurposing banking to do good things. And B Corp gives you a predefined template. It actually saved my brain a lot of hard work, because they just go through and say, have you thought about this? And you're like, yes.
Now I have. Thinking live.
Yeah. So that's very good.
So some of that 6 to 8 months, if it's you, the founder, is then teasing out some of the strategic elements as well.
Yeah. So I might have to backtrack on 6 to 8 months of full-time person, but just thinking about it. But it is really time consuming. If you're a 2-person team, one of you is going to be on half power doing your B Corp.
I think it's probably better to overestimate it than underestimate it, right? Because otherwise you start this process, time sink, and then sunk cost.
Yeah.
And actually, if you're trying to build a business that is not critical or it's not the right time, that probably is challenging.
Yeah, and it's something that, if you're obviously a purpose-led business, I think I've used this analogy before, but if you're www.tentsforukrainianrefugees.com and you say, should I be a B Corp? You're like, why? Like, what you do is on the label. If you're in a really overcrowded marketplace and you want to differentiate, and for us it was like, because we're designed to give B Corp, they go in and check our books and we do make the donations we say we do. They're our auditor, and I prefer them to be our auditor for that. But you see a lot of marketing agencies as B Corps. You see, and really thinking about, why does my business need to be this? I think it's fantastic. They've been very successful in the UK. There's a global community of people who are open to having a chat because you're a B Corp. There is, within the B Corp community, there are people who've come from social enterprise background who really believe in what B Corp is and really open to collaboration. And then there are other people who are like, dude, it's just marketing, whatever.
But I think you're smart to point out that really what it comes down to is, does your customer need this to be comfortable making a buying decision? And actually for you, that has been one of the ways that you've kept them on the phone. Quick, don't hang up.
Yeah.
But for lots of businesses, you don't need that.
Yeah. I hope B Corp aren't going to have a go at me.
No, but I think what I'm also not saying is never be a B Corp. I'm just saying, when do you do it in your life cycle as a founder? And I think that I often hear people kind of talking about, should we, shouldn't we? And I think there's so much fear of missing out as a founder. It's like perpetually your life. And it's not really fear of missing out. It's like fear of, I'm missing something I should be doing.
Yeah.
That I think it's helpful to have some steer on when is the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. I did it first up. I did it as soon as we could because we wanted to be the good guys in town.
Yeah.
If I was doing something slightly different, maybe wait a little bit, I think, because you need that capacity to be able to handle it.
Which kind of brings me on to another topic, which I didn't put in our show notes because I knew it was going to get caught by the person who I'm going to reference. But there's this epic person who introduced us, who happens to be a very dear friend of mine, but is also brilliant at what she does, which is helping startups think about strategy and think about communications. And one of the things she's helped me totally reframe is how you can think about PR as a startup
Yeah.
without massive budgets. So obviously I know that she's been involved with you guys helping out. So I thought it'd be a nice point to touch on, and massive shout out to Chrissy if anyone wants an intro. But I think I'd love to know more about how you're thinking about using PR, and maybe just helping founders understand how they could use it again without these huge spends, without going to an agency and paying, again, thousands and thousands.
I think you do need a guide to the PR world, but it doesn't have to be exorbitant or paying up for big fees. There's plenty of communities online outside of official B Corp networks. There's plenty of founder networks and WhatsApp groups, and you can percolate yourself. I think for the PR side, you do need to get on stage and talk, try and get yourself invited to an event. You do have value as a founder. If you really know your space, there'll be somebody with an event that needs a speaker to be like, can you come and just talk a little bit, because we've got a stage to fill. And if you really know what you're talking about, then you'll get the invite to just come and chat.
And I think even further than that, I would say, as someone who does a lot of stage stuff, put yourself on the invite list. Like, go. People often ask, like, how did you get involved with this conference? And half of the time the answer is like, I messaged them and said, do you need a speaker on this?
Yeah.
I'd love to talk on these topics. Chrissy's helped me a lot with my pitch on this stuff.
Yeah.
And the same with articles. I didn't know before Chrissy told me that you could go and pitch to someone like Sifted and say, I'd like to write an article on this. I thought you always had to be approached.
Yeah.
And I also didn't really know what they're interested in. I was like, is it just product launches, which actually often isn't very exciting to read about?
Yeah.
But actually, maybe it's an opinion piece. And to your point, as a founder, you are putting so much thought into this. And even the things, I think the thing I often want to say to founders, and why I think we all need slightly a Chrissy in our lives, but is that you spend your life in this space. And so you don't even know what's a novel idea anymore.
Yeah.
You often don't know what opinion is divisive or controversial, because you just spend your life saying this stuff. So you're like, well, I did a talk the other week, and the day before and thank God my co-founder talked me down, but I was like, this is so basic. Everyone's going to know this. And I was like, they're all going to look at me like, why are you teaching us to suck eggs?
Yeah.
And then I looked out at the audience and they were all nodding fiercely, all looking like, oh my God, this is new to me. I think founders forget that they have so much to add to these conversations.
Yeah.
So much they could be writing about and pushing as interesting articles, controversial opinions, interesting talks, themselves as panel guests.
Yeah. And just you saying that made me think about founder mental health, because if you're on a down patch as a founder, you forget that value. And it's very easy just to count your experience as nothing, because revenue is not where you want it to be. You're not growing fast enough. Like, what is my value? And probably putting yourself out there as a subject matter expert will help that. That was just, as you were saying, I was like, yeah, it must be. I'm trying to think about, everybody has tough patches. Those moments where you're like, oh, I'm so worthless. That actually, no, you can go and talk to people about your experience, and that there is inherent value to what you do, and you should celebrate that rather than just be down.
And you're so right. It's actually a very counterintuitive, but very good thing to do if you're in one of those spaces.
Yeah.
Because it's probably the last thing you feel like is an option.
Yeah.
But actually a really good way to just get some of that validation back. And I think we sometimes speak about validation. Almost like it's a bad thing. Like, oh my God, you want all this external validation. How egocentric, how egotistical. It's like, no, I think that's actually really normal.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
So let's dig in a bit on that founder mental health piece. So I think it's so important and not talked about enough. What else has helped you in those down patches?
I think you have to just really focus on your own equilibrium, that this is a long journey. You can't do 16-hour days and blow yourself up in this sort of Silicon Valley hero model. You're in this for 3 to 5 years before you see the end of the tunnel, probably. You got to keep yourself fit and healthy, eat your vegetables, do your exercise. But what all the what they say you should do: meditate, journal. The list isn't exhaustive. There's no new list of things, do things that nourish you outside of your work, stay away from booze and fags,
I mean, one of them I find easier than the
Yeah.
other. But I think it's so true. And I think what can become easy but is worth being careful of is, as a founder, to your point, there is a very long list. And I saw a meme the other day, which I loved, which just made me, I was like, this is it. And it was saying, if I was a billionaire and I wanted to kill the competition, I think I'd spread the idea that I got up at 4 a.m. every day. And I was like, that's so true. Because I'm thinking, how does everyone, you see these memes going around all the time, drink all your water and do 5 hours of exercise and, sleep 8 hours a day and work 16 hours a day.
Yeah.
And you're like, is anyone else not seeing this maths add up unless I have a team, which I can't afford because I'm a founder?
Yeah. And then it comes down to those days. I find that I just have to pick I literally just sit down and think, okay, top 5 things that are the most impactful, high power thing I can do today. And I'll do those first and then see how it goes. And as long as you're hitting those most powerful things, the tail end of work will get done. But then you get more momentum behind you and you get the buzz back, and then you're back up.
And I think we're not good enough at saying, well, I'm about to be the world's biggest hypocrite because my friends tell me this all the time, but we're not good enough at saying like rest is part of the work.
Yeah.
Because actually, if I end at 3 p.m. on a day, I'm like, oh my gosh, look at me being very lazy. It's like, no, I've actually just had a mad few weeks.
Yeah.
That's a really good life choice.
Yeah. And that's knowing your customer as well, because if you try and talk to people during August or Christmas about, do you want to change the way you do international payments? They're like, no.
Yeah.
So why bother?
Mm.
If you know your customers don't buy during Christmas or half terms or whatever, don't murder yourself. Just take it for what it is and plan that into, you'll be really intense outside of school holidays and do your admin work during school holidays. But you need to know how your customers buy to be able to do that.
And I think also giving yourself a bit of credit that the year that it all feels like it's gone wrong. I remember the first year that I was running coaching and training business, and it got to certain periods and I was like, where have all the customers gone? Why am I not delivering anything these months?
Yeah.
And we're filming this on the 1st of December and I am running no workshops this month. And 2 years ago, that would have filled me with dread and existential crisis. This year, I have been baking on it. I'm like, thank God I'm here.
Yeah.
But I think, to your point, you've got to learn that. And sometimes that learning is at the cost of a really stressful month financially. But remember, you're banking that learning next year. Think about your sales cycle. Think about what are you going to do differently. And to your point, it's an equilibrium game.
Yeah.
You're in it for the long haul. You get to bank that learning as long as you stay alive.
Yeah.
Sometimes hit and miss month to month.
Yeah, and I've seen that with a couple of people. It just made me think about people when they rebrand or do a new website. That is incredibly intensive work, but that doesn't get you any revenue. That's just work you have to do. So time that as well. Don't do that in your big sales season, or don't do it so intensely that you're knackered for your big sales season. I made that mistake. Like when we redid our website, I came out of an August having built this great new brand and
Yeah.
In the September, I was just knackered. I needed to take a week off. And you're like, no.
And I think also, and you've been doing this, and I'd love to kind of dive into it a little bit more, but this kind of bootstrapping by getting other revenue yourself in other ways so you can financially support yourself. I think one of the challenges is sometimes you have different sales cycles for those two things.
Yeah.
So I've increasingly learned that we're quieter for founder work with accelerators in August. Great. But really busy with schools and universities. Fine. Kind of balance. But actually that can lead to a year where I don't get any break because I'm actually switching between the two. Or the other way, you just have all your busy periods at once and it's overwhelming. And I'm not sure there's a right answer to this because you've got to pay the bills and you've got to build the business.
Yeah.
But what have been some of your learnings kind of bootstrapping by earning on the side? And what are some of the frankly emotional tolls of that? Because I think it's a great path to take. I'm a massive advocate for it. but I don't want to advocate for it in isolation of saying it's also really hard.
Yeah. But it is incredibly necessary if you're doing an impact business. That was the best advice I ever got. And I can't remember who the lady was. I saw her speak, and she's launched lots of impact businesses. And the idea that you can feed yourself with an impact business from the get-go just doesn't happen.
Right.
And you have to, it might be your passion and how you think the world can change, but you just got to have a reality check. And she was like, just take it from me, you will have to do different jobs while you do this. You can't do both. And forgiving yourself, because that's the other thing. There's this sort of narrative that if only you're totally focused on one thing and you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, then you will succeed. And the lack of success is linked to that lack of intensity and focus. You're like, no, like people have kids.
Yeah.
People have real life commitments that go on outside of this, and you've got to make those work. Otherwise, you just blow yourself up.
And it comes back to me to your long-term point. It's slower.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. There are so many times, and we've done the exact same thing. So If We Raise is an impact-focused business. And one of the reasons I love bootstrapping it is that we get to make decisions about revenue early that aren't motivated by, I personally need to pay the mortgage, which has doubled this year. So again, massive advocate for it, but I so relate because there's so many weeks where I'm apologizing to my co-founder or just hating on myself because I'm thinking, well, you could be growing this so much faster if you weren't off doing this other stuff.
Yeah.
But that pays the bills.
Yeah.
And gives you the mental. I also don't like this narrative for everyone. Works really well for some people, but to your point,
Yeah.
I think it's diminishing when you have responsibility. And lots of people, we don't talk enough about caring responsibility. And I was talking to someone the other day who was saying, they'd come over from Ghana, lots of family back home. They have responsibilities to send money home every month.
Yeah.
It's not just on them.
Yeah.
And I think we don't talk enough about caring responsibilities being so broad, so wide reaching, and actually meaning a lot of founders will have to go slower, but they will build something that lasts actually maybe them, their families, a lifetime.
Chris, you might object to me saying this, but that might be linked to the fact that, I don't know, the venture capital and tech world's run by white men who don't have any inclination for caring activities.
I would say that that's not untrue as a guess. I mean, I think there are, and always caveat, because otherwise people get really mad at me. I think there are incredible actors, and we can all be, point in case I'm talking to a white girl and I say, I'm a white middle class woman. There can be, hopefully, great allies who don't have the lived experience, but empathize. But to your point, I just don't think that empathy has been extended so far in the space.
No, but there is if you're serious about addressing the, you do see it in the stats, but it also has to come from a whole culture change of how people deal with founders and that growth and what capital is there to achieve. Because if you're demanding somebody has this much growth and they have to put everything aside in their life, people, I flippantly said only white men can do that, but like there aren't that many people that can do that.
Yeah.
And it is privileged to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it needs to be talked about, to your point, to change. And I think the first step is realizing the people who have the power to shift these things. There's a ton I don't know about because no one I know is talking about it to me because they don't think I'll listen or all sorts of reasons. And there are incredible initiatives. I think venture capital should come with a childcare allowance. I think all sorts should change. And there are really good actors, and often I actually saw someone the other day who was telling a story, and they actually tagged us in it because in part had been reminded by an episode with Victoria Armstrong, but they went to investor meeting and took their kid because they suddenly had last minute childcare. And the way the investor was about it and with their kids reinforced, this is an investor we want.
Yeah.
And I think, again, founders, there is a bit of, and what's rubbish is that who has the money means that you're going to a limited pool if you're only going to those who get it. But there is an element where it is a good litmus test of who am I going to enjoy working with? And to your point, that's one of the reasons I'm such an advocate for bootstrapping, because it does mean you're not forced into these options where there's a lot of compromise in who you take money from in order to grow.
Yeah.
So we fixed venture capital. We're just going
I'm
to...
like, am I ever going to get funded now?
I mean, this is it for founders, hopefully. I'm sure they won't all watch this episode.
Yeah.
But if they do, please share with your portfolio companies. Well, we've actually already done one of my closing questions, and we've got to wrap up. You said the best piece of advice you ever got was around that piece of working while you set up an impact startup. Was there anything else that really stood out to you that you think other founders could do with hearing?
It's a Harry Redknapp quote.
Okay.
And it was speech to his players. He just said, get out there and run around. And when you're just starting, that's what you've got to do. Just pump your legs and something happens. And that's all you can do. And there's no other, you've just got to get out there and run around and something happens. And you just exist long enough that people start coming towards you. I sort of liken it to being a stand-up comic. You play Scunthorpe for like 3 years. There's nothing wrong with Scunthorpe. But you're doing regional clubs for 3 years and all of a sudden you get a call saying, do you want to do Wembley?
Yeah.
And there's no rhyme or reason as to that moment where somebody says, stop playing Scunthorpe, you're good enough. You don't know it's about to happen, but it will happen. And you've just got to stay in the game long enough that somebody gives you that call and you get your chance.
Yeah. And I think that's so true. What I wish founders would do more is to question at what point are they not enjoying what they're doing enough that they should stop. Because I think to your point, you should keep playing long enough to survive. But also, not everyone's going to make it to Wembley. This is really brutal of me as an ending. But I do think as a founder, being like, actually, when am I going to keep running around the field and actually know that I'm going to be persistent?
Yeah.
And when am I going to call it a day are two really important sides to, I think, how you keep running.
Yeah, it's the other useless metaphor I use is it's like jumping out of a plane with a parachute and you tell everybody you're skydiving. You could just be falling out of a plane towards the ground. But in that middle period, you go to the pub and you tell everyone you're skydiving, which technically you are because you haven't hit the ground yet.
Yeah.
But at that moment of hitting the ground, you weren't skydiving, but you won't know.
Yeah.
So as long as you haven't hit the ground, and that process of hitting the ground will be different for everybody, just tell people you're skydiving and enjoy it.
Okay, final question. And I love impact businesses because it's a brutal question to have to answer. But what has been your proudest moment so far as a founder?
We help a charity who help kids with school materials in Pakistan, and they couldn't get money to the front line. And we worked with a fintech to get money to the front line. And we got all the photos of all these kids in a temporary school. And that was a little tear moment. That was very worth it. So that was probably my best moment.
I love that. Much better note to end on than be saying on startups or die.
Yeah.
Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's
Thank you.
Such a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Before you go, please do take a minute to follow so you never miss another episode. We have some incredible founders coming up. And I always love to hear what resonates with listeners. So do drop us a direct message on Instagram @NotMyFirstGuest with any moments that meant something to you, ideas for future episodes, or your own entrepreneurial stories you want to share. Until next time, happy startupping.